In 1789, France fell into revolution, and the world has never since been the same. The French Revolution was by far the most momentous upheaval of the whole revolutionary age. It replaced the old regime with a new kind of modern society. And at its extreme phase, it became very radical, so much so that later revolutionary movements often looked back to it as a predecessor. The ideas of the French Revolution, spreading far beyond France itself, decisively influenced the subsequent development of political parties and ideological conflicts throughout much of Europe and elsewhere. Indeed, the revolution still provokes highly charged debates about the characteristics or consequences of social reform, political radicalism, and revolutionary violence. At the time, in the age of the Democratic or Atlantic Revolution, from the 1760s to the 1860s, the role of France was decisive. Even the Americans, without French military intervention, would hardly have won such a clear settlement from England, or been so free to set up the new states and new constitutions that have just been described. And while revolutionary disturbances in Ireland and Poland, or among the Dutch, Italians, and others, were by no means caused by the French example, it was the presence or absence of French aid that usually determined whatever successes they achieved. The revolution in France also contributed to other revolutions in the wider Atlantic world. The Great Slave Uprising in the French colony at Saint-Domingue, which began in 1791 and led eventually to the creation of the Independent Republic of Haiti, was inspired in part by reports of the recently declared rights of man in France, and later French military interventions in Spain and Portugal set off, somewhat indirectly, the revolutionary movements that swept across Latin America after 1808. Few revolutions, in short, have ever generated such far-reaching historical upheavals. The 679, the French Revolution, unlike the Russian or Chinese revolutions of the 20th century, occurred in what was in many ways the most advanced country of the day. France was the center of the intellectual movement of the Enlightenment. French science then led the world. French books were read everywhere, and the newspapers and political journals that became very numerous after 1789 carried a message that hardly needed translation. French was an international language for educated and aristocratic people in most European countries. France was also, potentially before 1789 and actually after 1793, the most powerful country in Europe. It may have been the wealthiest, though not per capita. With a population of 24,000, the French were the most numerous of all European peoples under a single government. Even Russia was hardly more populous until after the partitions of Poland. The Germans were divided. The subjects of the Habsburgs were of diverse nationalities, and the English and Scots together numbered at this time only 10,000. Paris, though smaller than London, was over twice as large as Vienna or Amsterdam. French exports to Europe were larger than those of Great Britain. It is said that half the gold pieces circulating in Europe were French. Europeans in the 18th century were in the habit of taking ideas from France. They were therefore, depending on their social position, the more excited, encouraged, alarmed, or horrified when revolution broke out in that country. Social and cultural backgrounds. The old regime, the three estates. We have noted the hierarchical organization of the social and political institutions of the monarchical old regime, as the pre-revolutionary French society came to be called after it disappeared, and we have seen that enlightened despotism failed to alter these institutions in any fundamental way. The essential fact about the old regime was that it was still legally aristocratic, and in some ways feudal. Everyone belonged legally to an estate or order of society. The first estate was the clergy, the second estate was the nobility, and the third estate included 680 everyone else, from the wealthiest business and professional classes to the poorest peasants and city workers. These categories were important in that the individual's legal rights and personal prestige depended on the category to which he or she belonged. Politically, the estates were obsolescent. Not since 1614 had they assembled in an estates general of the whole kingdom, though in some provinces they had continued to meet as provincial bodies. Socially, they were obsolescent also. For the threefold legal division no longer corresponded to the real distribution of social influence, property, or productive activity among the French people. Conditions in the church and the position of the clergy have sometimes been much exaggerated as a cause of the French Revolution. The church in France levied a tithe on all agricultural products, but so did the church in England. The French bishops often played a part in government affairs, but so did bishops in England through the House of Lords. The French bishoprics of 1789 were no wealthier than those of the Church of England were found to be when investigated 40 years later. In actual numbers, in the secular atmosphere of the Age of Enlightenment, the clergy, especially the monastic orders, had greatly declined. So that by 1789, there were probably not more than 100,000 Catholic clergy of all types in the entire population. But if some past historians overemphasized the importance of the clergy, still it must be said that the church was deeply involved in the prevailing social system. For one thing, church bodies, bishoprics, abbeys, convents, schools, and other religious foundations owned between 5 and 10% of the land of the country, which meant that collectively the church was the greatest of all landowners. Moreover, the income from church properties, like all income, was divided very unequally, and much of it found its way into the hands of the aristocratic occupants of the higher ecclesiastical offices. The Church 681. This image of French peasants shows how farmers prepared their fields and planted seeds during the 1760s, when the picture was published in a French book. The agrarian system shaped property rights and social hierarchies, as well as the supply of food in French cities, all of which created resentments or fears that contributed to the coming of the French Revolution. The noble order, which in 1789 comprised about 400,000 persons, including women and children, had enjoyed a great resurgence since the death of Louis XIV in 1715. Distinguished government service, higher church offices, army, parliaments, and most other public and semi-public honors were almost monopolized by the nobility in the time of Louis XVI, who, it will be recalled, had mounted the throne in 1774 and had abandoned recent attempts to break the nobility's power in the traditional parliaments. Repeatedly, through parliaments, provincial estates, or the assembly of the clergy dominated by the noble bishops, the aristocracy had blocked royal plans for taxation and shown a desire to control the policies of state. At the same time, the bourgeoisie, or upper crust of the Third Estate, had never been so influential. Although the bourgeoisie was an amorphous social category, indeed, some historians argue that bourgeois refers to a class that never had a real social identity. The 682 number of French merchants, lawyers, and other professional groups clearly grew over the course of the 18th century. The fivefold increase of French foreign trade between 1713 and 1789 suggests the growth of the merchant class and of the legal and governmental classes associated with it. As members of the growing merchant and professional groups became economically stronger, more widely read, and more self-confident, they resented the distinctions and privileges that enhanced the status of nobles. Some of these were financial. Nobles were exempt on principle from the most important direct tax, the taille, whereas bourgeois persons obtained exemption with more effort. But so many bourgeois persons enjoyed tax privileges that purely monetary self-interest was not primary in their psychology. The higher echelons of the non-noble social elite resented the nobles for their sense of superiority and their social arrogance. What had formerly been customary respect was now felt as humiliation. Many otherwise successful and wealthy people felt that they were being shut out from office and honors, and that the nobles were seeking more power in government as a class. The revolution thus began in the social and political collision of two moving objects: an assertive nobility that sought to protect its privileges, and an expanding, assertive bourgeoisie that resented the nobles' protected status. The nobility. The common people, below the commercial and professional families in the Third Estate, were probably as well off as in most countries, but they were not well off compared with the upper classes. Wage earners had by no means shared in the 18th century wave of business prosperity. Between the 1730s and the 1780s, the prices of consumers' goods rose about 65%, whereas wages rose only 22%. Persons dependent on wages were therefore badly pinched, but they were less numerous than today. For in the country, there were many small farmers, and in the towns, many small craftsmen who made a living not by wages, but by selling the 683 product of their own labor at market prices. Yet in both town and country, there was a significant wage earning population, which was to play a decisive part in the revolution. The Third Estate, the agrarian system of the old regime. Over 4/5 of the people lived on agrarian lands and in rural villages. The agrarian system had evolved so that there was no serfdom in France, as it was known in Eastern Europe. The peasant owed no labor to the lord, except a few token services in some cases. The peasants worked for themselves, either on their own land or on rented land, or they worked as sharecroppers, or they hired themselves out to the lord or to another peasant. The manor, however, still retained certain surviving features of the feudal age. The noble owner of a manor enjoyed hunting rights, or the privilege of keeping game preserves, and of hunting on his own and the peasant's land. He usually had a monopoly over the village mill, bake shop, or wine press, for the use of which he collected fees called banalités. He possessed certain vestigial powers of jurisdiction in the manorial court and certain local police powers from which fees and fines were collected. These seigneurial privileges were, of course, the survivals of a day when the local manor had been a unit of government and the noble had performed the functions of government, an age that had long passed with the development of the centralized modern state. Survival of feudal privileges. There was another special feature to the property system of the old regime. Every owner of a manor, there were some bourgeois and even wealthy peasants who had purchased manors, possessed what was called a right of eminent property, with respect to all land located in the 684 manorial village. This meant that lesser landowners within the manor owned their land in that they could freely buy, sell, lease, and inherit or bequeath it, but they owed to the owner of the manor, in recognition of his eminent property rights, certain rents payable annually, as well as transfer fees that were payable whenever the land changed owners by sale or death. Subject to these eminent property rights, land ownership was fairly widespread. Peasants directly owned about 2/5 of the soil of the country. Bourgeois owners held a little under a fifth. The nobility owned perhaps a little over a fifth, and the church owned somewhat under a tenth, the remainder being crown lands, wastelands, or commons. Finally, all property rights were subject also to certain collective rights, by which villagers might cut firewood, run their pigs in the commons, or pasture cattle on land belonging to other owners after the crops were in, which they could easily do because there were usually no fences or enclosures. All this may seem rather complex, but it is important to realize that property is a changing institution. Even today, in industrialized countries, a high proportion of all property is in land, including natural resources in and below the soil. In the 18th century, property meant land even more than it does today. The bourgeois class, whose wealth was so largely in ships, merchandise, or commercial paper, also invested heavily in land, and in 1789 they owned almost as much land in France as the nobility, and more than the church. The revolution transformed the law of property by freeing the private ownership of land from all the traditional and indirect encumbrances described: manorial fees, eminent property rights, communal village agricultural practices, and church tithes. It also was to abolish other older forms of property, such as property in public office or in masterships in the guilds, which had worked to the advantage mainly of closed and privileged groups. In final effect, the revolution defined and established the institutions of private property in the modern sense, and therefore brought the greatest economic benefits to the landowning peasants and the bourgeoisie. Property ownership 685. The peasants not only owned 2/5 of the soil, but also worked almost all of it on their own initiative and risk. In effect, the land owned by the nobility, the church, the bourgeoisie, and the crown was divided up and leased to peasants in small parcels. France was thus already mainly a country of small farmers. There was no big agriculture as in England, Eastern Europe, or the plantations of America. The manorial lord performed no economic function. He lived. There were, of course, exceptions, not by managing an estate and selling his own crops and cattle, but by receiving innumerable dues and fees. During the 18th century, in connection with the general aristocratic resurgence, there was an economic change that has often been called the feudal reaction. Manorial lords, faced with rising living costs and acquiring higher living standards because of the general material progress, collected their dues more rigorously or revived old ones that had fallen into disuse. Leases and sharecropping arrangements also became less favorable to the peasants. The farmers, like the wage earners, were under a steadily increasing pressure. At the same time, the peasants resented the feudal dues more than ever because they often regarded themselves as the real owners of the land and viewed the lord as a gentleman of the neighborhood who for no reason enjoyed a special income and a status different from their own. Resentments arose because many of the fees and obligations in the property system no longer bore any relation to real economic usefulness or activity. The feudal reaction. The political unity of France, achieved over the centuries by the monarchy, was likewise a fundamental prerequisite and even a cause of the revolution. Whatever social conditions might have existed, they could give rise to nationwide public opinion, nationwide agitation, nationwide policies, and nationwide legislation only in a country already politically unified as a nation. These conditions were lacking in Central Europe. In France, a centralized French state existed. Reformers did not have to create it, but only capture and remodel it. The French in the 18th, 686 century already had developed the sense of membership in a political entity called France. The Revolution saw a tremendous stirring or expansion of this sense of membership and of fraternity, turning it into a passion for citizenship, civic rights, voting powers, and the use of the state and its sovereignty for the public advantage. But at the very outbreak of the revolution, people could salute each other as citoyen or citoyenne and shout, "Vive la nation!" Political culture and public opinion, Air 1770. The social and economic resentments that existed among ambitious people in French cities and among peasants in the French countryside could finally explode in a revolutionary upheaval because 18th century writers had created a culture that encouraged political and social criticism. Educated persons in the Third Estate could draw on Enlightenment conceptions of reason, natural rights, and historical progress to complain about the irrationality of ancient privileges or the injustice of noble prerogatives. Enlightenment thought provided a language in which people could now describe their dissatisfactions with the obstacles that stymied professional or economic ambitions. The Revolution and the Enlightenment. It has been argued that the famous works of the French philosophies led directly to the revolutionary events of 1789. It was the fault of Voltaire, critics explained. It was the fault of Rousseau. Many who supported the revolution also made such claims for its intellectual origins, so that the history of the French Revolution has always been linked in complex ways with the legacy of the Enlightenment. Yet most historians now argue that the connections between the philosophies and the revolution were by no means as direct as people once imagined. The philosophies themselves favored enlightened social reforms, but they were not revolutionaries, and except perhaps for Rousseau, they rarely promoted the political rights of the lower classes. Their most important 687 publications, including the famous Encyclopédie, often attracted more readers among the nobility than among the middle classes. Political theory was far less popular than novels or social satires. There was an enormous audience for Rousseau's Julie, or the New Héloise, for example, but few persons read the social contract. The notion that great Enlightenment writers caused the French Revolution is therefore an inadequate explanation for what happened, much as claims that bourgeois economic interests caused the revolution are also inadequate. It is nevertheless true that the Enlightenment contributed widely to new forms of criticism, public debate, and public opinion, most of which challenged the traditional authority of the French king and nobles. The last 2 decades of the old regime were filled with intense political controversy. as the monarchy sought unsuccessfully to suppress the traditional French parliaments, as successive ministries sought to raise new revenues, as French journals reported on the new American state constitutions, and as pamphleteers increasingly attacked the officials and courtiers at Versailles. The critical spirit that had developed in salons, coffee houses, and literary arguments spread rapidly into a developing public sphere of political debate. The new political pamphlets were scarcely concerned with the subtle nuances of political theory. In fact, many consisted of little more than scandalous rumors of sexual misconduct or financial corruption in the affairs of the royal family and government ministries. Stories of corruption in high places stripped away the once sacred image of the monarchy, the church, and the social hierarchy. At the same time, the reading public developed an interest in scandalous legal cases that pitted members of the aristocracy against aggrieved persons of the Third Estate, or that revealed immorality and decadence among ancient noble families. Lawyers could publish their legal briefs without securing the approval of government censors, and, using this freedom, they bolstered their legal arguments with appeals to popular sentiment or natural rights. The injustice of inherited privilege thus became a recurring theme in the scandalous stories of social and personal disputes that French lawyers carried from French courtrooms to the tribunal of public opinion. 688 critical spirit. By 1789, in France, educated persons in all social classes were coming to believe what Voltaire had said after the famous Calas affair in the 1760s. Opinion governs the world. Campaigns to influence public opinion became a powerful political force in French society during the last decades of the old regime, and most such campaigns appealed for public support in the name of reason, rights, or justice. In these ways, the critical thought of Enlightenment culture entered into bitter political conflicts that led finally and unexpectedly to the Revolution. 42. The Revolution and the Reorganization of France. The financial crisis. The revolution was precipitated by a financial collapse of the government. What overburdened the government was by no means the costly magnificence of the court of Versailles. Only 5% of public expenditures in 1788 was devoted to the upkeep of the entire royal establishment. What overburdened all governments war costs, both current upkeep of armies and navies and the burden of public debt, which in all countries was due almost totally to the high costs of past wars. In 1788, the French government devoted about a quarter of its annual expenditure to maintenance of the armed forces, and about half to the payment of its debts. British expenditures showed almost the same distribution. The French debt stood at almost 4 billion livres. It had been greatly swollen by the War of American Independence. Yet it was only half as great as the national debt of Great Britain and less than a fifth as heavy per capita. It was less than the debt of the Dutch Republic. It was apparently no greater than the debt left by Louis XIV, 3/4 of a century before. At that time, the debt had been lightened by repudiation. 689. No responsible French official in the 1780s even considered repudiation, a sure sign of the late 18th century expansion and public influence of the well-to-do classes, who were the main government creditors. Yet the debt could not be carried, for the simple reason that revenues fell short of necessary expenditures. This, in turn, was not due to national poverty, but to the tax exemptions and tax evasions of privileged elements, and to complications in the fiscal system, or lack of system, by which much of what taxpayers paid never came into the hands of the Treasury. We have already described how the most important tax, the taille, was generally paid only by the peasants, the nobles being exempt by virtue of their class privilege, and office holders and other wealthy persons obtaining exemption in various ways. The church, too, insisted that its property was not taxable by the state, and its periodic free gift to the king, though substantial, was less than might have been obtained from direct taxation of the church's land. Thus, although the country itself was prosperous, the government treasury was empty. The social classes that enjoyed most of the wealth of the country did not pay taxes corresponding to their income, and, even worse, they resisted taxation as a sign of inferior status. Problems of taxation. A long series of responsible persons. Louis XIV himself, John Law, Maupeou, Turgot, had seen the need for taxing the privileged classes. Jacques Necker, a Swiss banker who became director of the finances in 1777, made moves in the same direction and, like his predecessors, was dismissed. His successor, Calonne, as the crisis mounted, came to even more revolutionary conclusions. In 1786, he produced a program in which enlightened despotism was tempered by a modest resort to representative institutions. He proposed, in place of the taille, a general tax to fall on all landowners without exemption, a lightening of indirect taxes and abolition of internal tariffs to stimulate economic production, and a confiscation of some properties of the church. He also sought to give the 690 propertied elements a greater interest in the government by proposing the establishment of provincial assemblies in which all landowners should be represented without regard to estate or order. The French government's financial crisis in the 1780s led these two ministers, Charles Alexandre de Calonne and the Archbishop Loménie de Brienne, on the right, to propose new taxation plans. But neither a special assembly of notables nor the Parliament of Paris would accept their proposals. The failure to enact tax reforms forced Louis XVI to convene the long inactive Estates General, which would give members of the Third Estate new opportunities for political action. Print collector, Getty Images. Calonne's program, if carried out, might have solved the fiscal problem and averted the revolution. But it struck not only at noble privileges and taxation, but also at the threefold hierarchic organization of society. Knowing from experience that the Parliament of Paris would never accept it, Calonne in 1787 convened an Assembly of Notables, hoping to win its endorsement of his ideas. The notables insisted on concessions in return, for they wished to share in control of the government. A deadlock followed. The king dismissed Calonne and appointed as his successor Loménie de Brienne, the worldly wise Archbishop of Toulouse. Brienne tried to push the same program through the Parliament of Paris. The Parliament rejected it, declaring that only the three estates of the realm, assembled in an Estates General, had authority to consent to new taxes. Brienne and Louis XVI at first refused, believing that the Estates General, 691 if convened, would be dominated by the nobility. Like Maupeou and Louis XV, Brienne and Louis XVI tried to break the parliaments, replacing them with a modernized judicial system in which the law courts should have no influence over financial policies. This led to a veritable revolt of the nobles. All the parliaments and provincial estates resisted. Army officers refused to serve, the intendants hesitated to act, and noblemen began to organize political clubs and committees of correspondence. With his government brought to a standstill, and unable to borrow money or collect taxes, Louis XVI on July 5, 1788, promised to call the Estates General for the following May. The various estates were invited to elect representatives and also to draw up lists of their grievances. Resistance of the nobles. From Estates General to National Assembly. Because no Estates General had met in over a century and a half, the king asked for proposals on how such an assembly should be organized under modern conditions. This led to an outburst of public discussion, which soon expanded far beyond all previous campaigns to influence public opinion. Hundreds of political pamphlets appeared, many of them demanding a change in the old system by which the three estates sat in separate chambers, each chamber voting as a unit. This voting system was widely criticized because it meant, in practice, that the chamber of the Third Estate was always outnumbered. But in September 1788, the Parliament of Paris, restored to its functions, ruled that the Estates General should meet and vote as in 1614, in three separate orders. The nobility, through the Parliament, thus revealed its aim. It had forced the summoning of the Estates General to protect and enhance its own political influence, and in this way the French nobility initiated the revolution. The revolution began as another victory in the aristocratic resurgence against the earlier absolutism of the king. The nobles actually had a liberal program. They demanded constitutional government, guarantees of personal liberty for all, freedom of speech and press, 692 freedom from arbitrary arrest and confinement. Many now were even prepared to give up special privileges in taxation. This might have worked itself out in time, but in return, they hoped to become the preponderant political element in the state. It was their idea not merely to have the Estates General meet in 1789, but for France to be henceforth governed through the Estates General, a supreme body in three chambers. One for nobles, one for a clergy in which the higher officers were also nobles, and one for the Third Estate. The aims of the nobilitas. This was precisely what the Third Estate wished to avoid. Lawyers, bankers, business owners, government creditors, shopkeepers, artisans, working people, and peasants had no desire to be governed by lords temporal and spiritual. Their hopes for a new, more equitable political and legal system, formed by the philosophy of the Enlightenment, stirred by the Revolution in America, rose to the utmost excitement when good King Louis called the Estates General. The ruling of the Parliament of Paris in September 1788 thus came to them as a slap in the face, an unprovoked class insult. The whole Third Estate turned on the nobility with detestation and distrust. The Abbé Sieyès in January 1789 published his famous pamphlet, What is the Third Estate?, declaring that the nobility was a useless caste that could be abolished without loss, that the Third Estate was the one necessary element of society, that it was identical with the nation, and that the people of the Third Estate thus embodied, or should embody, the sovereignty of the French nation. Through CAA, the ideas of Rousseau's The Social Contract entered the thought of the Revolution. At the same time, even before the Estates General actually met, and not from the books of philosophies so much as from actual events and conditions, nobles and commoners viewed each other with fear and suspicion. The Third Estate, which had at first supported the nobles against the despotism of the king's ministers, now ascribed to the former the worst possible motives. Bourgeois critics vehemently rejected the political program and ambitions of the nobility. Class 693 antagonism poisoned the revolution at the outset and threw many articulate members of the Third Estate into a radical and destructive mood. The Third Estate reacts. Convoked for the first time in 175 years, the Estates General met in a large hall at Versailles in May 1789. This picture shows Louis XVI seated on his throne, with deputies of the clergy seated on his right, those of the nobility on his left, and those of the Third Estate facing him at the other end of the hall. Print collector, Getty Images. The Estates General met as planned in May 1789 at Versailles. The Third Estate, most of whose representatives were lawyers, would not accept the division of the orders into three separate chambers. It insisted that deputies of all three orders should sit as a single house and vote as individuals. This procedure would give an advantage to the Third Estate because the king had granted it as many deputies as the other two orders combined. For 6 weeks, a deadlock was maintained. On June 13th, a few priests, leaving the chamber of the First Estate, came over and sat with the Third. They were greeted with jubilation. On June 17th, the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly. Louis XVI, under pressure from the nobles, closed the hall in which it met. The members found a 694 neighboring indoor tennis court, and there, milling about in a babel of confusion and apprehension, swore and signed the oath of the tennis court on June 20th, 1789, affirming that wherever they gathered, they were the actually existing National Assembly, and that they would not disband until they had drafted a constitution. This was a revolutionary step, for it assumed virtually sovereign power for a body that had no legal authority. The king ordered members of the three estates to sit in their separate houses, though he now presented a reforming program of his own, too late to win the confidence of the disaffected, and in any case, continuing the organization of French society in legal classes. The self-entitled National Assembly refused to back down. The king faltered, failed to enforce his commands promptly, and allowed the assembly to remain in being. In the following days, at the end of June, he summoned about 18,000 soldiers to Versailles. What had happened was that the King of France, in the dispute raging between nobles and commoners, chose the nobles. It was traditional in France for the king to oppose and reduce the autonomous powers of the nobility. For centuries, the French monarchy had drawn strength from the support of urban or bourgeois social groups. All through the 18th century, the royal ministers had carried on the struggle against the privileged interests. Only a year before, Louis XVI had been almost at war with his rebellious aristocracy. In 1789, he failed to assert himself. He lost control over the Estates General, exerted no leadership, offered no program until it was too late, and provided no symbol behind which parties could rally. He failed to make use of the profound loyalty to himself felt by the bourgeoisie and common people, who yearned for nothing so much as a king who would stand up for them, as in past times, against an aristocracy of birth and status. He tried instead, at first, to compromise and postpone a crisis. Then he found himself in the position of having issued orders that the Third Estate boldly defied. And in this complex political predicament, he yielded to his wife Marie Antoinette, to his brothers, and to the court nobles, all of whom told him that his dignity and authority were being undermined. At the end of June, Louis XVI undoubtedly intended to dissolve the Estates General by military force. But what the Third Estate most feared was a future in which the 695 king would support the nobles as they sought to control the government of the country. There was now no going back. The revolt of the Third Estate had allied Louis XVI with the nobles, and the Third Estate now feared the nobles more than ever, believing with good reason that they now had the king in their hands.